Hello, my name is David Murray. I'm the Associate Director for Prevention and the Director of the Office of Disease Prevention at the National Institutes of Health. I'm pleased to welcome you to the final 2024 ODP Early Stage Investigator Lecture. We created this lecture to highlight early career prevention scientists who have not yet served as a principal investigator for a substantial NIH-supported research project, but who have made outstanding research contributions to their respective fields and are poised to become future leaders in prevention research. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping items. You can submit questions during the webinar via the chat pod. You'll need to open the pod by hovering your cursor at the bottom of the Zoom window and then clicking on the chat icon. Please direct your questions to hosts and panelists. We will open the floor to questions at the end of the lecture. The slides and video recording will be posted on our website in coming weeks. We are very excited to present one of our 2024 awardees, Dr. Benjamin Hsu. Dr. Hsu is Chief of the Glaucoma Service at the University of Southern California Roski Eye Institute. Dr. Hsu's research focuses on developing new diagnostic tools to detect and care for patients with glaucoma using optical coherence tomography imaging and artificial intelligence. He also studies the impact of glaucoma on patient populations and healthcare systems worldwide, using epidemiological and electronic healthcare data, and devises new strategies to deliver more efficient and effective glaucoma care. Dr. Hsu will share recent advances in early detection and prevention of primary angle closure glaucoma using optical coherence tomography and artificial intelligence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hsu.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today. I'd like to thank the NIH Office of Disease Prevention for the opportunity to present some of our work today. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my financial disclosures, including the NIH, as well as the Glaucoma Research Foundation. I do receive research support from Heidelberg Engineering, and I will be talking about their OCT imaging system today. I'd like to begin by sharing a couple of facts about glaucoma. Glaucoma is an optic neuropathy, which means that it is a disease of the optic nerve. And glaucoma is the most common cause of irreversible vision loss worldwide. Glaucoma currently affects around 80 million people. And the prevalence of the disease is expected to rise to around 110 million by the year 2040, primarily due to an expanding and aging population worldwide. Intraocular pressure, or IOP, is an important risk factor in glaucoma pathogenesis. Increased pressure on the optic nerve can lead to glaucomatous damage, and this intraocular pressure often rises due to the accumulation of aqueous humor inside the eye. It's important to point out that elevated IOP does not define glaucoma. In fact, the majority of patients with glaucoma do not have elevated intraocular pressure. However, intraocular pressure remains the primary modifiable risk factor, and all treatments in glaucoma currently are targeted toward lowering of intraocular pressure. Before I talk about angle closure, I'd just like to review how aqueous humor conventionally flows out of the eye. Aqueous humor is produced by the ciliary body and then flows between the iris and the lens in order to enter the anterior chamber. There, it leaves the eye through the trabecular meshwork, which is located at the angle that is formed by the junction between the iris and the cornea. In angle closure, there is contact between the peripheral iris and the trabecular meshwork. This impedes or blocks the outflow of aqueous from the eye, and when angle closure is extensive, this can lead to elevated intraocular pressure and eventually angle closure glaucoma. Primary angle closure glaucoma, or PACG, is a common cause of permanent vision loss worldwide. The condition currently affects around 24 million people, and 3/4 of cases of PACG occur in Asia, where the disease is endemic. Like glaucoma overall, the prevalence of PACG is rising, and it's expected that there will be 34 million cases by the year 2040. This rise in PACG prevalence is concerning, as PACG is highly visually damaging. It confers 2.4 times higher odds of blindness compared to primary open-angle glaucoma, which is the predominant form of glaucoma. Gonioscopy is the clinical technique that we currently use to evaluate the anterior chamber angle to detect patients at risk for PACG. In gonioscopy, a contact lens is placed on the surface of the eye, and this allows us to evaluate the anatomical structures in the angle recess. When we perform gonioscopy, the key anatomical structure to visualize is the trabecular meshwork. When we cannot see this structure, we tell our patients that they have angle closure and may be at risk for angle closure glaucoma. The importance of gonioscopy in the glaucoma evaluation has been emphasized by the American Academy of Ophthalmology through their preferred practice pattern guidelines. The AAO recommends that gonioscopy should be performed in all patients who are suspected of glaucoma, suspected of angle closure, or who will be receiving incisional glaucoma surgery. Gonioscopy is also crucial as it forms the current basis of definitions for primary angle closure disease, or PACD. Primary angle closure suspect, or PACS, is the mildest form of PACD in which there are 2 or more quadrants of angle closure on gonioscopy. This is thought to be a low-risk state for PACG. Primary angle closure, or PAC, is the next stage in which there is also the presence of peripheral anterior synechiae, which are adhesions between the iris and the trabecular meshwork, or the presence of elevated intraocular pressure above 21 millimeters of mercury. PAC is thought to be a high-risk state for PACG. Finally, PACG is diagnosed when there is evidence of glaucomatous optic nerve damage with or without vision loss. Despite being the current clinical standard, gonioscopy has a number of limitations. Research has shown that gonioscopy is subjective and expertise dependent, and that there's only moderate inter-examiner reproducibility, even between trained glaucoma specialists. As gonioscopy requires contact with the eye, gonioscopy can also be uncomfortable and therefore time-consuming for some patients. These limitations of gonioscopy contribute to a major issue in the field of glaucoma. Specifically, PACG often remains undetected and untreated until after severe vision loss has occurred. This figure shows the prevalence of blindness that is associated with PACG based on data from population-based epidemiological studies conducted in Asia. We see here that the prevalence of blindness associated with PACG exceeds 25% in most regions. The exceptions to this rule are in countries with better access to eye care, such as Japan and in Singapore. Until recently, little was known about the burden of PACG here in the United States. Primary reasons for this include the fact that we have a large and diverse population, and that the burden of PACG was thought to be relatively low here due to a lower proportion of Asians in the population. Fortunately, we have access to big healthcare data that can inform us about the 700,000 or so cases of PACG. This data is generated when eye care providers see their patients using electronic medical records, which generates data that can help us inform us about patient care. Examples of big healthcare data include the IRIS registry, which is an electronic healthcare records database, as well as the Optum database, which is an electronic claims records database. We recently used data from the Optum database to evaluate utilization of gonioscopy in patients undergoing glaucoma evaluations here in the United States. The Optum database contains healthcare claims data on over 65 million Americans. And in this database, we found nearly 200,000 patients who underwent initial glaucoma evaluation between the years 2009 to 2020. Despite recommendations by the American Academy of Ophthalmology that all of these patients received gonioscopy, we found that less than 30% had a record of gonioscopy within 6 months of their initial glaucoma evaluation. We also found that patients who are diagnosed with primary open-angle glaucoma were far less likely to have received gonioscopy compared to patients diagnosed with PACG, which suggests that there may have been misclassification or misdiagnosis of glaucoma in this case without the performance of gonioscopy. We've also used data from the Optum database to evaluate patterns in the evaluation and the detection of angle closure. In this study, we've identified 31,000 patients newly diagnosed with PACG between 2009 and 2020. When we look back from the initial date of PACG diagnosis, we found that 3/4 of these patients had never received a previous diagnosis of angle closure. The failure to detect angle closure early on means that these patients never had the opportunity to receive sight-saving treatments with laser or surgery. Also, concerningly, we found that this phenomenon of late detection of angle closure was more common amongst certain subpopulations, including Black Americans. Recently, we also used data from the IRIS registry in order to evaluate the prevalence of blindness among patients newly diagnosed with PACG here in the US. The IRIS registry is an electronic healthcare records database that is administered by the American Academy of Ophthalmology. It contains data on over 73 million Americans. In this database, we identified 49,000 patients newly diagnosed with PACG between 2015 to 2019. We found that despite high healthcare expenditures in the United States, 12.4% or 1 out of 8 patients newly diagnosed with PACG was blind in at least one eye. Our definition of blindness here was 2400 visual acuity or worse. We also found that some racial groups, such as Black and Hispanic Americans, were also at higher risk of blindness at time of first diagnosis. We also found that late detection, which is when glaucoma develops without prior detection of the angle closure, conferred nearly a 2-fold higher odds of blindness, again, highlighting the importance of early detection and treatment of angle closure to prevent the onset of glaucoma. These data convey an urgent need in the field of glaucoma, the need for a convenient and equitable method to detect patients at risk for PACG. Fortunately, we are living in the era of optical coherence tomography, or OCT. OCT is a convenient, non-contact, light-based imaging method for obtaining information about the anatomical structures in the eye. OCT can produce beautiful, high-resolution images in mere seconds that can inform us about patient risk for disease. Anterior segment OCT, or ASOCT, is OCT technology adapted for the anterior segment, or for the front of the eye. Here we can clearly see the anatomical structures of the anterior segments, such as the cornea, the iris, and the lens. However, one structure that cannot be directly visualized due to the wavelength of the imaging laser is the trabecular meshwork. Therefore, we have to rely on the detection of the scleral spur, which is the anatomical structure that sits directly posterior to the trabecular meshwork, to identify patients who might have angle closure. Here is an OCT image of a patient who has an open angle. Here, the scleral spur is marked with a yellow arrow, and we can see that anterior to the scleral spur, there is no contact between the anterior iris surface and the intercorneal curvature. Therefore, this angle is open. This is a representative image of an angle that is closed. Here we can see that anterior to the scleral spur, there is contact between the peripheral iris and the intercorneal curvature where the trabecular meshwork would be located. This is called iridotrabecular contact, which defines angle closure on OCT imaging. Now that we have access to an alternative method of evaluating our patients for angle closure, my lab a few years ago asked this question: can analysis of ASOCT images be automated to detect gonioscopic angle closure? Fortunately, we also live in the era of artificial intelligence, or AI. We all know that AI is a powerful technology that promises to change all aspects of our daily lives. AI has entered our collective consciousness through popular tools such as ChatGPT, and may also help us with daily activities such as operating our motor vehicles. AI also holds tremendous potential to transform the delivery of healthcare. AI can broadly be defined in the healthcare domain as when computers are taught cognitive functions, such as the ability to analyze images and detect disease. AI has tremendous potential to revolutionize healthcare, primarily by increasing access to care for patients, as well as reducing the costs of care. Deep learning is a popular form of AI that has been widely applied in the field of ophthalmology to automate image analysis for disease detection. In 2019, we published this study in which we developed a deep learning algorithm to automate the detection of gonioscopic angle closure in anterior segment OCT images. In this study, we used data from the Chinese American Eye Study, which was a population-based epidemiological study that was led by USC investigators. This study was conducted in one of the suburbs of Los Angeles, where there is a high density of Chinese Americans. In total, CHES recruited over 4,500 Chinese Americans, all of whom received gonioscopy and ASOCT imaging. In order to develop our algorithm, we used just over 4,000 ASOCT images. These were distributed roughly equally between open and closed angles. Each ASOCT image was paired with a corresponding gonioscopy grade that was provided by a trained ophthalmologist who performed gonioscopy on each participant. In this study, angle closure was defined as a gonioscopy grade of 0 or 1, and an open angle was defined as a gonioscopy grade of 2, 3, or 4. These are the receiving operating characteristics curves, or ROC curves, that show the performance of the algorithm by plotting the sensitivity against 1 minus specificity. The red curve shows the performance of the algorithm for detecting angle closure in a single sector of the eye based on a single ASOCT image. We see here that the area under the curve, or AUC, was 0.93, which corresponds with a balanced sensitivity and specificity of around 85%. For detecting angle closure in multiple quadrants of the eye, the performance of the algorithm is even better, with the AUC values exceeding 0.95, which corresponds with a balanced sensitivity and specificity of around 90%. One issue with AI algorithms is that their performance can be somewhat fragile outside of the original training cohort. This led us to assess the generalizability of our algorithm using data from independent community-based as well as hospital-based sites. In this study, we had data from the Chinese American Eye Study, as well as a community-based primary health clinic based in Singapore. We also collected data from glaucoma clinics at the USC Roski Eye Institute. At each site, gonioscopy was performed by a different specialist, and at USC, we had 2 ophthalmologists perform gonioscopy so that we could have measures of intergrader reproducibility. It is important to mention, however, that we use the same OCT system at all 3 sites. These are the 3 ROC curves that show the performance of the algorithm at each of the different sites. We can see here that despite differences in sample size and patient demographics, the performance of the algorithm was remarkably consistent across all 3 sites, with AUCs ranging between 0.9 to 0.92. We can also see that in the USC site, which is the curve to the right, that the algorithm approximated the sensitivity and specificity of the second ophthalmologist, who is shown in the black circle. This shows that this algorithm performs well in all practice settings and that it approximates the performance of a trained ophthalmologist. Despite the fact that now we have a method to detect patients with gonioscopic angle closure that is convenient and automated, here we encounter a second major issue in the field of glaucoma. Specifically, it's unclear which patients with PACS, that is early angle closure, will benefit from prophylactic treatment. Here, I'd like to spend a moment to talk about the most common form of treatment for angle closure, which is laser peripheral iridotomy, or LPI. In LPI, a YAG laser is used to place a full thickness hole through the peripheral iris. This helps to create a communication between the anterior and posterior chambers of the eye, which then leads to anatomical configuration changes such as flattening of the iris curvature and widening of the angle. In eyes with elevated intraocular pressure from angle closure, it can also lead to reduction in IOP. The benefits of LPI in eyes with PAC and PACG, that is more severe angle closure, is clear. Based on landmark studies such as the EAGLE trial, we know that LPI produces robust IOP lowering in angle closure eyes that have high IOP above 21 millimeters of mercury. LPI can also be used to break pupillary block and therefore prevent further acute attacks of angle closure. These clear benefits of LPI have led to a consensus by both the World Glaucoma Association as well as the American Academy of Ophthalmology, who both recommend LPI in eyes with PAC and PACG. However, based on population-based epidemiological studies, we know that the majority of PACD worldwide is mild in the form of PACS. Therefore, the question arises, what is the benefit of LPI in eyes with milder angle closure? This was the topic of study of the landmark Zhongshan Angle Closure Prevention Trial, or ZAP trial. The primary objective of the ZAP trial was to assess the benefit of LPI for the prevention of angle closure. The ZAP trial recruited 889 participants, all of whom had bilateral PACS. These participants were between ages 50 to 70 and were all mainland Chinese. Participants were randomized to LPI in one eye and monitoring of the other eye. These participants were monitored for 6 years, and the study endpoint was progression from PACS to PAC, which was defined as the development of peripheral anterior synechia, elevated intraocular pressure over 24 millimeters of mercury, or an attack of acute angle closure. The ZAP trial yielded 2 primary findings. First, LPI was effective, reducing the risk of progression by around 50%. We see here that the LPI treated group had only 19 events compared to 36 events in the control group. However, the other primary finding of the ZAP trial was that the risk of progression was very low even among untreated eyes at only 0.8% per eye year. The authors of the ZAP trial conducted a cost-effectiveness analysis and determined that 44 PACS eyes needed to receive treatment to prevent 1 case of PAC, and 126 PACS eyes needed to receive treatment to prevent 1 case of PACG. These findings led the ZAP trial authors to conclude that efforts to identify using gonioscopy and treat PACS with iridotomy on a population basis probably are not the best use of resources. Recently, we used data from the Optum database to evaluate real-world utilization of LPI in patients with milder angle closure. In the Optum database, we identified 52,000 patients newly diagnosed with angle closure who had not yet developed signs of glaucoma. Here we found that despite the relatively mild nature of the angle closure, more than a quarter of these patients had received LPI, which seems to be many more than would be recommended by the ZAP trial. We also found that certain populations, such as Asian and Hispanic Americans, were more likely to receive LPI, perhaps indicating that angle closure was more severe in these populations. Nevertheless, these data all seem to point to another urgent need in the field of glaucoma, the need for a precise and reproducible method to identify high-risk PACS eyes that should receive LPI to prevent progression to PACG. Fortunately, ASOCT images can be analyzed quantitatively in addition to qualitatively. First, we have to segment the cornea and the iris and the lens, and then we have to manually mark the locations of the scleral spurs. This then allows us to obtain measurements of biometric parameters that describe the size, shape, and configuration of the anterior segment and its anatomical structures. The primary focus of my lab early on in my career was answering this question: are ASOCT measurements predictive of IOP and angle closure outcomes? In 2018, we used data from the Chinese American eye study to evaluate the correlation between IOP and angle configuration measured by OCT. Here, our measure of angle width was trabecular iris space area, or TISA, which is a measure of the amount of area in the angle recess. This figure shows our primary findings from the study, and it plots IOP against measurements of TISA. We can see here that for patients with wider angles, on the right of this curve, there is effectively no relationship between TISA measurements and IOP. However, below a specific measurement threshold, there emerges a strong inverse correlation between IOP and TISA measurements. This would suggest that as patients' angles become more narrow, their risk for elevated IOP also begins to rise. Recently, I also collaborated with the authors of the ZAP trial in order to conduct a study assessing ocular biometric risk factors for progression of primary angle closure disease. In this study, we identified 643 untreated PACS eyes so that we could learn more about the natural progression of angle closure without treatment. All ZAP participants had received gonioscopy and ASOCT imaging at baseline, and the outcome measure in our study was progression from PACS to PAC. This table summarizes the baseline demographic and clinical differences between non-progressors and progressors in our study cohort. We see here that progressors tended to have higher intraocular pressure at baseline. However, there was no difference in cumulative gonioscopy score, which is the sum of the gonioscopy grades across the 4 quadrants. There was a significant difference in measures of angle width represented by angle opening distance, as well as trabecular iris space area. In both cases, progressors tended to have narrow angles at baseline. Progressors also tended to have flatter iris curvature, as well as smaller iris area. We developed a multivariable model assessing predictors of progression. In this model, our measure of angle width was angle opening distance measured by ASOCT. Here we see that adjusted for age, iris curvature, and anterior chamber depth, AOD measurements were significantly associated with progression. Specifically, for each 10 microns narrower in AOD, the odds of progression increased by 10%. When we replaced AOD with gonioscopy score as our measure of angle width, we found that gonioscopy score was not associated with progression. This would suggest that ASOCT provides us with unique information that was not previously available using gonioscopy to help identify patients at higher risk for angle closure progression. More recently, we've been conducting other studies that show ASOCT measurements may help us provide precision care to patients with angle closure. In the top study, we imaged patients both in the dark and in the light in order to obtain more information about angle width. The convention up to this point was always to image patients in the dark, as we know that is the lighting condition in which the angle is most narrow. However, our hypothesis in this study was that we in fact spend most of our time in lit environments, and that it's a cumulative risk over the course of the day rather than in only high-risk states. And in the study, we actually found that measurements in the light were more predictive of progression than measurements in the dark. We've also looked at the role of ASOCT measurements for predicting angle closure in eyes that had received LPI in the ZAP trial, and we've demonstrated that ASOCT measurements can even predict anatomical changes that occur after LPI, thereby helping us identify patients who might respond best to laser treatments. I hope the data that I've shown has provided compelling evidence that ASOCT imaging could transform the way that we care for our patients with angle closure. The technology could help us precisely risk stratify angle closure patients so that we can deliver earlier treatments to high-risk patients, thereby preventing cases of PACG. However, I do need to mention that ASOCT imaging has not yet been widely adopted for clinical use, and therefore I'd like to spend the rest of my talk talking about barriers to clinical implementation that need to be overcome before the technology can be used to help our patients. The first barrier I'd like to discuss is the fact that most eye care providers don't have the time or the expertise to manually analyze ASOCT images. As I mentioned, the scleral spur has to be marked before measurements can be obtained, and most eye care providers are not trained to identify the scleral spur, and this task can be quite difficult in eyes with angle closure. Therefore, in 2020, we sought to automate scleral spur detection using artificial intelligence. In this paper, we described a method and a deep learning algorithm for scleral spur detection. However, we developed this algorithm for a research OCT device that was never approved for FDA use. Therefore, recently, we've been collaborating with Heidelberg Engineering to develop a similar scleral spur detection algorithm for their FDA-approved Anterion ASOCT system. In order to develop this algorithm, we used just over 4,000 ASOCT images. Each of these images was paired with the X and Y coordinates of the scleral spur location. In order to perform an independent validation of the algorithm, which was developed using data collected primarily in Germany, we collected independent data at the USC Roski Eye Institute. In total, we acquired over 1,300 images, which produced over 2,600 scleral spur locations. These scleral spurs were annotated by 2 human graders. This scatter plot shows the agreement between the 2 human graders. And here, the scatter plot shows the error of the second grader, which was calculated as the reference minus the predicted scleral spur coordinates. We see that the scatter plot had a median error of around 61 microns. The scatter plot shows the agreement between the human and the machine. The 2 scatter plots are very similar, and the median error was also similar at 56 microns. This table shows the integrator reproducibility of the biometric measurements associated with those scleral spur locations. In the column in the left, we can see the agreement between the reference grader and a glaucoma specialist. And we see that the intra-class correlation coefficient exceeded 0.96 for all parameters. This indicates excellent agreement between the 2 humans. We see that this performance was matched by the deep learning algorithm, which also yielded ICC values that exceeded 0.96 for all parameters. This shows that this algorithm is capable of expert level scleral spur detection as well as biometric analysis of ASOCT measurements, which makes the technology easily accessible for all providers. A second barrier to the implementation of ASOCT in angle closure is the fact that ASOCT devices are relatively uncommon and expensive. Fortunately, ASOCT technology is becoming much more common in eye care offices due to the technology being incorporated into modern biometers. Biometers are a common tool that are needed by ophthalmologists in order to measure the eye prior to cataract surgery. The fact that modern biometers utilize ASOCT technology means that a larger number of eye care providers now have access to this technology, and some modern biometers include the Heidelberg Anterion, Alcon Argos, and the Tomei Cassia 2, all of which can produce beautiful images of the anterior segment. However, it is important to mention that these devices are still quite expensive, and therefore low-cost OCT technology is needed for resource-limited settings. A third barrier to implementation is that there's a lack of standardization between ASOCT systems and images. The image appearance can vary widely between OCT systems. These are 5 representative images from 5 different systems, and we see that each system has a different way of representing the information. Also, each image has to be corrected for refraction correction, which is how light travels through the cornea and other refractive elements of the eye. Therefore, we sought to assess the interoperability of these devices by assessing the inter-device agreement of measurements from these devices. In 2017, when I was a glaucoma fellow at the University of California, San Diego, we conducted a study in which we compared 2 OCT devices that were utilizing different technologies. Specifically, one was using swept source OCT technology, whereas the other was using spectral domain OCT technology. Here we found that while there was a correlation between the measurements had an offset that prevented them from being used interchangeably between the 2 devices. More recently, we've performed a comparison of measurements between 2 swept source OCT devices, and we find that the results here are more encouraging, where there is both an excellent correlation and agreement between measurements between the 2 devices, which suggests that modern ASOCT devices produce measurements that could be used interchangeably. A final barrier that we need to overcome is that little is known about angle anatomy and PACG pathogenesis outside of Asian populations. Although the disease is endemic in Asia, we have produced data that shows that the disease has broad impacts here in the United States and also contributes to disparities in glaucoma outcomes. I'm excited to share a little bit about our recently funded study, the Multiracial Angle Closure Progression Study, or MAP. This is a 5-year study on angle closure, and it will be conducted in Los Angeles, where we have a diverse patient population. The study has 3 primary aims. The first aim is to understand why some racial groups are at higher risk of PACG. Even though I presented data that PACG is most prevalent in Asian regions and disproportionately affects Asian populations, the anatomical basis for this observation is still not completely understood. Therefore, we hope by performing ASOCT image on a diverse population, we can begin to gain insights into this topic. The second aim of this study is to establish an OCT-based definition of narrow angles. Gonioscopy doesn't appear to be sufficient for identifying high-risk patients who warrant treatment, and therefore we hope to identify a cutoff measured by ASOCT that can be used to guide treatment. Finally, we like to use modern OCT technology that allows for high-density imaging or dynamic imaging to identify novel risk factors to further hone in on patients who are at risk for PACG. In summary, PACG is a visually devastating disease, even here in the United States. ASOCT can help us identify high-risk angle closure cases, whereas the current convention of performing gonioscopy cannot. Artificial intelligence can help address shortcomings of ASOCT to make the technology more convenient for clinical use. However, more work is needed to overcome implementation barriers and improve clinical outcomes for patients at risk for this visually devastating disease. I'd like to acknowledge the hard work and contributions by all of the members of my lab, and I'd also like to thank all of you very much for attending this lecture today and for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Xu. Very interesting. A lot of material in a short period of time. Let me start by asking, what drew you to study glaucoma?
Yeah, so I decided on glaucoma when I was a second-year resident, and really what drew me to glaucoma is the clinical decision-making process. As you can see, we have a lot of diagnostic information that is available to us, and glaucoma also requires establishing a long-term relationship with patients. The disease is irreversible, and therefore we end up taking care of our patients essentially for life. I really enjoyed that aspect of the patient care, and it is a very deep subspecialty within ophthalmology. that requires still a lot of research. There's a lot of potential here to improve the care of glaucoma patients using modern technologies such as OCT and artificial intelligence. And so it was these various aspects that drew me to glaucoma, but certainly the impact of the disease is unquestionable. And the disease is highly preventable as well. And so I really enjoy early detection and the ability to modulate the trajectory of patients to ultimately save their sight from this disease.
Dr. Murray, you are muted.
This is a question about one of the early papers that you presented. The person asking the question didn't identify the paper specifically, but the question may point you towards it. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the extent to which the data were balanced in the first paper that you showed? And does that mean that the data were not imbalanced? That may mean more to you than it does to me.
I presume that they are talking about the first AI study, since there wasn't any balancing in the big data studies that I presented. There we were simply reporting on patient outcomes as well as practice patterns. So I assume that they are talking of, all right, let me scroll back here. But I presume that they're talking about the development of the angle closure detector. And here, yes, we prioritized balancing of images that had open angles versus angle closure in the training process, since we didn't want to bias the algorithm in any way. It is true that in the general population, angle closure is fairly rare, and therefore you could have a really good detector just by simply never detecting angle closure. And that's why we took this approach of balancing the open and closed angles in the training data set.
Right. Makes sense to me. You said that 75% of cases of primary angle closure glaucoma appear in Asian populations, or perhaps it was in Asia. What is known about the genetics of this form of glaucoma?
Yeah, so there have been some genes that have been identified through GWAS studies that speak a little bit about the pathogenesis of the disease. Some of these genes are responsible for intercellular junctions. And so something I didn't talk too much about was the role of the iris in this disease. The iris is ultimately what is pushed up into the trabecular meshwork to impede outflow of aqueous. And so the iris also acts as a sponge, where when the pupil dilates and constricts, there has to be fluid exchange between the iris and the anterior chamber. So if the iris is unable to squeeze out fluid due to these very tight intercellular junctions, then it remains thick and boggy, and this predisposes the iris to blocking the trabecular meshwork. The genetic studies have also found that there are abnormalities in the cholinergic receptors of the iris, and this dictates the pupillary response, which means that the iris may spend more time in a configuration that predisposes it to blocking the iris. So we have identified certain genes that are responsible, but because most of the genetic samples related to PACG came from Asia, we do not know if these genes actually generalize between different racial and ethnic groups. So there's likely a genetic component. There is also likely a biometric component that we don't understand. For example, we know that patients with very shallow anterior chambers, that is a close distance between the lens and the cornea, that these patients are more at risk for angle closure. And that's because the lens takes up a large portion of the front of the eye. And as it grows and develops into a cataract, it actually pushes the iris into the trabecular meshwork. And this is why cataract surgery or lens extraction is a treatment for angle closure. What we find, though, is that even though Asians are at higher risk for PACG, we don't find that they actually have shallower anterior chambers compared to other racial and ethnic populations. And therefore, we really need to perform some form of imaging, like ASOCT imaging, that provides us with more information about potential anatomical differences that could help explain this difference in PACG prevalence.
Thank you. Another question from our audience regarding the ROC curve. Due to the randomness of machine learning algorithms, each run will produce a curve. So how do you obtain the curves that you showed in your presentation? Are they just from a single run? Were they an average? How were those generated?
Yeah, so because these were 3 ROC curves superimposed on each other, I didn't show the confidence intervals. So typically you will do an iterative process where you'll run the algorithm many, many times in order to generate an estimate of how confident the algorithm is when making this prediction. So even though I didn't show it here, I do show them here in this population. And what you can see here is that despite these many iterations, the performance of the algorithm falls within a very narrow range, and that the confidence intervals here, which are shown in the shaded regions, are actually quite tight. This is also very important when testing the algorithms to ensure that they are in fact confident in their predictions.
Looking at this particular slide, the accuracy of an algorithm trained on one population may not be as good when applied to different populations. We understand that.
That's
and
right.
you're reporting here results for 3 groups, but the sample sizes are quite small for 2. Are there
That's right.
other studies underway to apply the algorithm to other populations or to larger numbers of patients from these populations?
Yeah. So there's a certain commitment in terms of time and resources in order to assess the generalizability of these algorithms. And so in the USC cohort, we actually recruited these patients prospectively, and having 2 ophthalmologists perform gonioscopy on all these patients was really the rate limiting step. This was more of a proof of concept to show that this technology could be used outside of the original training cohort, which was based on the Chinese American Eye Study data. The Singaporean data was retrospective, where it had already been collected, which is why it was such a large data set. I think if we are to proceed with detection of gonioscopic angle closure, a larger multi-site validation of the algorithm would be appropriate. However, there are several reasons we won't be doing this. One is that the device used in these studies was a research-only device. And so we need to focus on devices that our patients actually are able to have access to. And then the other is due to the limitations of the gonioscopy. So here the algorithm was detecting gonioscopic angle closure, but as I mentioned, the clinical utility of that appears to be diminished based on the fact that it's difficult to guide treatment based on gonioscopy alone. And so even though we demonstrated here that this algorithm is generalizable and therefore could be used, we have ideas about better methods to identify high-risk patients who would benefit from treatment at this point.
Thank you. OCT, which is an alternative, is fast, and you have an algorithm to help interpret the results. How does it compare to gonioscopy in terms of comfort and cost?
Yeah, so in terms of comfort, it is far superior because it is non-contact. The patient is simply positioned in front of the device, and a button is pressed, and within a couple of seconds, we can obtain dozens, if not hundreds, of images to represent the anterior segment. And so from a convenience standpoint, it is far preferable to gonioscopy, which requires the eye be anesthetized, and then for the contact lens to be placed on the eye. Some patients have extreme phobia of anybody approaching their eyes, and it can be very, very hard to perform gonioscopy. So from a convenience standpoint, gonioscopy, ASOCT is far superior. From a cost perspective, OCT technology's cost is decreasing. However, it is still very expensive. So these devices run anywhere between $40,000 to $70,000, depending on how they're configured, whereas a gonio lens is only a few $100s. Now, the difference there is that the gonio lens requires a trained and ideally an experienced examiner, whereas OCT images, their analysis can be automated. However, I think the two are really complementary, where gonioscopy should still be performed because there are exam findings that cannot be detected using OCT. Gonioscopy should still be performed, but for patients who appear to have some risk, we need to be able to more precisely risk stratify those patients for treatment. I think that's the real issue. In the future, when OCT technology becomes cheaper and more accessible, it's possible that we can simply evaluate all of our patients using OCT. But currently, there is that limitation of cost, and that's why I mentioned it as a barrier to implementation.
Is the effect of LPI permanent?
That's also a great question. Studies show that LPI produces measurable angle widening in at least 3/4 of patients. It also prevents acute attacks of angle closure. However, it is not definitive treatment because the lens inside the eye will continue to grow over time as cataract formation occurs. And this ultimately will continue to push the iris forward until it can contact the trabecular meshwork. And so the consensus guidelines are that in patients who have visually significant cataracts, those cataracts should be removed, because when we take out the cataract, we replace it with a synthetic lens that is far smaller and takes up far less space inside the eye. So you can imagine when you replace the lens here, the iris will fall back because of the extra space that is now available to it. And this creates tremendous angle widening. And so for patients who have visually significant cataracts, then they can receive this definitive treatment for their angle closure. And the vast majority of these patients will no longer have to worry about developing PACG. And so PACG is highly preventable because it is essentially an anatomical disease. However, many patients exist in this early angle closure stage who do not have visually significant cataracts. And therefore, the question is who should be treated and who shouldn't be treated. But LPI does not need to be repeated because its effect, if it will have an effect, carries on.
Are there non-surgical methods to prevent glaucoma?
When speaking about glaucoma as a whole, yes. For primary open-angle glaucoma, the primary treatment is lowering of intraocular pressure, whether it's through eye drops, laser, or surgery. Eye drops can also be used in the cases of PACG, and oftentimes they will be used to tide patients over who have non-visually significant cataracts. For patients who wouldn't derive that kind of visual benefit, it's harder to talk them into doing surgery. And therefore, sometimes we will try drop therapy in order to lower intraocular pressure. The concern there, however, is that when you leave the angle closed for a long period of time, synechia can form. And these adhesions, even if you break them during surgery, the function of the trabecular meshwork is not always reestablished due to this chronic mechanical damage to the trabecular meshwork. And so typically in angle closure, it is recommended you perform an LPI to try to widen the angle in patients who do not have visually significant cataracts, but otherwise in patients with cataracts, they go for lens extraction.
Is there any evidence to date for methods that could reverse blindness that happens as a result of this or other forms of glaucoma?
Yeah, so there is a lot of research that is underway to try to reverse the vision loss that results from glaucoma. This is a really difficult task because the optic nerve is essentially an extension of the central nervous system. And it's actually composed of over 1 million axons of retinal ganglion cells. And so part of it is trying to regrow the axons, but part of it is also reestablishing the circuitry of the visual pathways so that patients have meaningful sight if the optic nerve is to be restored. But optic nerve regeneration is a major field of research, not just in glaucoma, but in ophthalmology as a whole, since there are other diseases of the optic nerve. However, I think due to the difficulty of this task, certainly early detection and prevention are still the most effective means of mitigating the visual impact of glaucoma. And but hopefully within our lifetime, we will have methods to regrow or regenerate the optic nerve to restore sight in those who have already lost it from glaucoma.
Thank you. You identified factors predictive of glaucoma progression that were measured using OCT. And I know one of your goals is to identify which patients and which eyes would benefit from LPI or other procedures. Can you say a little bit more about the next steps in this line of research that you plan to pursue? You've got a lot of pieces that you're juggling. Just curious about the path forward.
Yeah, so this is where we hope that MAPS will really tie everything together. Clearly, we've conveyed the need for these types of methods and the potential of OCT measurements in identifying high-risk patients. So in MAPS, what we're doing is we're recruiting patients based on OCT measurements alone, rather than using gonioscopy. And what we're doing is we have a cutoff that we've identified based on our previous work that we think will have a high number of patients who will progress to either developing elevated intraocular pressure or even glaucoma during a short period of time. And so we're going to be observing these high-risk patients for a period of 3 years to see what is the clinical course. We're not delivering any treatments to these patients, aside from when they need it, when it is clinically indicated. So I think that really is the next step, which is to take our findings, which were based on retrospective analysis of existing data, and then to apply it to a pseudoclinical setting and actually see what happens when we redefine narrow angles using OCT instead of gonioscopy. And so I look forward to reporting on our efforts over the course of the next 5 to 10 years.
So the MAP study is a prospective cohort study.
That's correct. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't get to go into the precise details. So in AIM-1, we will be performing screening at multiple sites at hospital locations at USC. Essentially, patients will be walking through the hallways, and we have recruitment booths where we also have ASOCT imaging capabilities. And so we're screening these patients to identify patients who didn't previously know that they had narrow angles, or they may have known, but haven't yet received treatment. And then we're going to be referring them for longitudinal monitoring in the glaucoma clinics at USC, where we'll be performing very robust analyses, imaging assessments to try to identify risk factors, additional risk factors for progression, as well as to see what is the clinical course of patients when they're referred based on a new definition of narrow angles.
Those that progress far enough, you'll refer for LPI or other treatment.
That's correct. That's correct. In fact, they'll be followed in my clinic, and we have study endpoints which coincide with the recommendations by the World Glaucoma Association and the American Academy of Ophthalmology for treatment. And so the study endpoint is clearly defined for treatment. The question is just how do we identify patients who are progressing rapidly towards treatment but may not know it.
Dr. Xu, I want to thank you for an outstanding presentation. It's really fun to see the logic of the sequence of studies that you've done and the way that you've tackled different aspects of this and brought things together. And now you're able to launch this prospective cohort study. I want to thank you for this presentation. I want to thank our participants for their questions. As I mentioned earlier, we will be posting the slides and a recording of today's presentation on our website in the next few weeks. I want to thank everyone for joining today's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much.